We had a very happy childhood, but we came through a bad patch when the war broke out. My mum, God bless her, my elder sister was working in an ammunition factory. Agnes is working in Manchester, welding jerry cans. My other sister went to work in the country for some doctor and his wife. And my mum went to England to work. But we missed our mum something terrible. A friend of hers was going and it sounded good. And my mum was good at doing meals and running a kitchen and what have you, you know. And she was in the kitchens doing all the soups and the food for the men coming in after being out on the flights, you know, all the Air Force guys. She was working there. And she thought it was one way, because back home, you can have 50 kids, you don't get a penny. There's no child allowance, there's no benefits. You know, because we lived out the garden. Thank God we had a garden. The hardest part was when they said we had to have gas masks, you know, and I went to the centre with my two sisters. Imelda was fine, I was all right. George was all right, but Vi, her lips went purple, she was shaking. I take her outside, talk to her, she's got to wear it, he said, because if this happened, I didn't understand half what he was saying, but I knew you had to have the mask. So finally we got around her to wear the mask. At certain times, when you hear the sounds or something, you had to put your mask on. And I used to always have to calm her down. And then they said, oh, they built up some air raid shelters. It's only young, so I said, what are they for? Well, it's safer if you all make for the air raid shelters. And I'm thinking, my mum is miles away. So my sister, she comes home from work, throws her bike then, says, look, get a bit of dinner. She said to my dad, get the dinner, I'm going, because she's explained to her hands. They've been bombed where our sister is and an auntie and a friend. So she went off to see how they got on, had a bit of dinner. She came home, she said, I said, how is Auntie? Auntie had arthritis, and she knew the doodle bugs or something were coming over, and she's got a long metal table, and she crawled underneath there and sat underneath there with the baby. And it saved her and the baby, because half of it was blown off. Half of the house was blown to pieces.
And she knew to get under the table.
But she, under this metal table, big long old-fashioned metal table, and she had the sense to lift it the best she could because her arthritis, and she grabbed it with her teeth and her hand and got under the table with the baby and saved the baby. Wow. Yeah, but you know, and then the rations was on, oh my God. So when the war was over, I saw lights in the street and people were singing. And I thought, my dad can't hear me, I'm going to see what's happening. So I went to the door, Mrs. Brown was standing there with her daughter, Sarah. I said, what's going on? She said, the war is over. I said, is it? She said, the war is over, she said, and your mummy be coming home. Oh my God, the tears. And everybody, kids, I got my two sisters up out of bed and dressed them because we was all out in the street singing. And they were singing that song, When the Lights Go On Again. and it was lovely. But my mum couldn't come home straight away because they put a ban on that you had to wait so long to get home. But God, when my mum come home, did we celebrate? I think we were celebrating for a week. And all the neighbours were coming in. Everybody was merry, everybody was drinking, everybody was eating, everybody was happy. Nobody had anything, but we were happy people, you know. And everybody looked out for everybody. We all gave up butter, because you only got a little bit of butter a week. So we gave up butter, and us kids all had Marge. My mum had the butter. That's why I don't like sugar. We all gave up sugar in our tea and in our cocoa so that Mum and Dad could have it. You know, things were very scarce. If we had apples, if the apples were ripe in the garden, get a load of apples and rhubarb and make pies for us. And every Friday, no, every Saturday, she would do a great big bake. You couldn't go in the kitchen. She'd bake and with all tins full of all different things. And that was for the week for us kids, you know. But you come home, you'd have a nice dinner. You might have cabbage, potato and carrots. But meat, forget it. Oh, you might have, on a special day, you might have a sausage. You know, when it was on rations, it was really hard. Even the clothes was on rations, weren't they? Because I remember we had do you call him a tallyman? A man that comes and he gives you a cheque and you buy your clothes and you pay it each week.
And obviously I don't remember very much of being a baby, but I do remember being 4 years old and starting school in Scotland, because my dad he joined the RAF, and he was stationed in Tayport, Dundee in Fifeshire. And I do vaguely remember going up to Scotland on a train. That would have been early 1940, and that was the year that was called the Phony War, because nothing was happening much. But then within a couple of months, lots of things happened, of course, and the bombing started. While my dad was invalided out of the Air Force, we were evacuated. But differently, we weren't sent, as so many children were, on trains with labels on their coats and their gas masks to people they didn't know. My mum was found a farmhouse where the farmer and his wife and extensive family, they were Quakers. And one of my aunts was the matron of a Quaker boarding school in Oxfordshire, near the town of Banbury. And the village was called Sibford Ferris. And Aunt Marjorie arranged this, and so my mum was driven by Aunt Marjorie from South London to Sibford Ferris, and we were evacuated to the farmhouse, and they were very happy years and very healthy years. You know, the rationing was harsh, but we always had enough food on the farm. Fresh eggs, where many people, you couldn't get fresh eggs. You had dried eggs to make omelettes with. Yes, you're making a face. They weren't very nice. The first shipment of bananas was sent over to the UK, and we got some. You had to have a ration book. You weren't allowed to buy as many as you think you'd like to gobble up. You were given just, we had a bunch with 7 bananas on, I remember. And of course my brother had never seen the fruit before, and so he was so keen to try. He broke a banana off, and my mum was just in the middle of telling him, now to eat a banana you've got to be... But before that could happen, he went crunch straight through the skin. Can you imagine how awful that was? Yeah, so he would never eat banana ever again in his life. And I remember one day the air raid siren going, and that's the most horrific sound. If I hear it on a old newsreel or old film, I get a familiar fear churning in my stomach, still. And also when you hear the all clear, which was a rising and falling siren, which was equally disturbing. Yes, I'll never forget those two sounds. And my mum, we had an air raid shelter in the garden, and I remember my mum putting grass all over it and then planting nasturtium seeds. So occasionally we would, when the air raid siren sounded, we would run out and hide inside the garden shelter.
First things, I don't remember the war, but one of the first things I can remember is the end of the war. It was in Edinburgh, 1945, and my father picked me up and wrapped me in a big warm woolly rug and carried me outside, and everywhere people were cheering. It was a noise like a football crowd, and this was the end of the war. And then someone said, "Oh look, she's fallen asleep again," and they carried me back indoors. But I also remember barrage balloons and searchlights in the sky, and we had an Anderson shelter which always flooded in the back garden. And then after that we emigrated.
They never made ice cream during the war. You weren't allowed to make ice cream. And I remember they started making ice cream. They used to do the blocks about that big, you know. And we were about 14, just started work. We all went and bought a big block of all nearly sick, I think, trying to eat it all at once. That was right at the beginning of the war. In September it started. That was a few days after the war started. We couldn't understand where he'd come from, this plane, and what the bombs were all about, you know. Whether it was our people practising or whether it was a German plane after the Royal Small Arms Factory, and they thought my dad was on top of the air raid shelter. They kept flying round, perhaps they thought it was Enfield Lock or somewhere, you know, Small Arms Factory, and because that's what they were always trying to bomb, Enfield Lock. And the powder mills where they made the explosives and where they made the rifles and guns. But during the war, all you could hear all day long from where we lived in Manor Road, machine gun fire, where they're testing the machine guns at Enfield Lock. Ever so loud, you know. You could hear them all day long. We didn't go to school for several months before, when the war started, until they built the air raid shelters at the schools. We went round to sort of 3 or 4 children went to somebody's house, and the teacher used to do the rounds, go to the different houses, and your homework sort of thing, you know, and then come next day she'd come and check. And then once they built the air raid shelters, we could go back to school then. Because as soon as the air raid started, you had to go down, the sirens went, you went down the air raid shelter. Didn't do any lessons. That's why we're not educated.
Yes, I do remember D-Day. My mum did her very best that all of us were in fancy dress. I was dressed up as the lady from the Quality Street sweetie tins with a poke bonnet, and my hair wasn't long, but my mum, how clever she was. She was a hairdresser in her youth, and she had some ringlets made. It might have been from her own hair. I don't know, as a little girl. She had lovely curly, long curly hair. And she'd made these ringlets into little, like, hair pieces. I remember she pinned these ringlets, one on each side of my face, and then put the poke bonnet on. And so I'm looking out of this photograph and these little twiddly ringlets. I never managed to grow my hair long enough to make ringlets out of it. But yes, that was a great outdoor party, and the local coalman loaned his cart and his horse, and all the children who were at this street party had rides round the block on it. That was quite exciting. And he urged the horse to go as fast as it could. I always remember that, the noise of the horse's hooves on the road, and the coal cart, of course, was filthy with coal dust. And when we got off, we were smothered in coal dust. And some of the mothers were furious with the coalman. Why couldn't you have swept it first, they said. Yeah, yes, that was a happy day. We had cakes and sandwiches and Smith's crisps. In the days of the original Smith's crisps, you didn't get flavours, you just got one sort, which was salted, and you had in each packet there was a little royal blue twist of paper, and in that you had your salt. So you'd undo it and shake it into the bag, and then you'd shake the bag up so that the salt covered all the crisps.
We had gas masks, yes. I've still got mine. Unfortunately, I took it to school to show children once, and one boy put it on without asking and broke the straps outside. Right. They were getting perished, but yes, you had to have a gas mask in a square box, cardboard box, and you were supposed to carry it with you everywhere. People got a bit blasé and didn't after a while, and because it's a gas attack, you had to put it on straight away. But we never had a real one. I don't know if there was a real gas attack in Britain, really. You had to be ready for it. Because gas was used. My mother, when the rationing things finished, my mother went yeah, and tore out the ration books, and threw them away. And I think the identity cards went too. I'm not sure, yeah. But I did actually find some in a jumble sale in Enfield from a family who lived in Brimsdown. So I kept those as souvenirs. And when it came, thought we didn't have a shelter at all. You didn't expect bombs to fall in the middle of the countryside. One lunchtime, about 12:15, a Lancaster on fire caught the top of our goods shed roof and crashed into those fields. He must have thought he could land, but it was so wet and they hadn't hoped, and the thing halted and disappeared underground.
And we had the shelter in the garden, and she had a wonderful system. Something else my grandma made, I had a siren suit, which was made from an old brown coat, which was Astrakhan curly fabric, and was like Winston Churchill used to wear one, but he didn't have a hood on with fur around the edges and bunny rabbit ears, which mine had, and my mother used to put me into that, and so we'd emigrate to the air raid shelter, which had 4 bunks in it, but no door. So my mother made a door from one of the bunks, pinning a rug onto the door so that we did have a door, because imagine in the winter it was freezing. But anyway, Jim and Connie slept together on one bunk. And no, they had one each, and my mum and I had the other one. But yeah, we did that many nights. I'm very lucky to have my brother and sister, and it was only my brother's forethought, and he was only about 7 or 8. They were coming back from school with this rat-tat-tat-tat, and they looked round, and it was a German aeroplane coming along, using up his bullets. And they started running, obviously, but they couldn't get very far. And then Jim spotted Mrs. Citri's door was standing open, and he got Connie and he threw her in the doorway, because the garden wasn't as wide as this, threw her in the doorway and followed her in as the plane flew over where they'd been. If they hadn't had that thought, but what a lucky escape.
Well, the war, which was quite a frightening thing to remember, with running into the air raid shelters in the garden and being very frightened, and then being evacuated to Scotland, which was quite a upset at first, because I had to leave my parents and when you leave home, you're very sad because you're not very old and you've left a happy home, but the danger of the air raids was so much that Scotland was a much safer place to be. I think if you were rather nervous going to another wild place far from where your home was, and I had two dolls that I wanted to take with me to stay with these people who were quite strange to me. And I remember writing home to my mother and saying to her, my dolls were called Jean and Peter, and I said, do they cry for me? Because I cry for them, and I miss them so much. But there we are, that was how things were then. If you had a doll or something to comfort you as you've left your home, that was a very nice thing to have. But unfortunately, they didn't come to stay in Scotland, they just stayed here. And one is now in a home. It's be like a museum, if you like, for dolls, real China dolls. You know, not ones, I mean, beautiful dolls are made today, but they're not like the very, very old dolls of pure China. And my father bought it for me, one in particular, and they had lovely hair on them, you know. So the whole thing was a great loss to me when I couldn't have them with me in Scotland. But, well, that was just how it was then. I remember we used to have ration books, and if someone had a wedding, they would offer each other's, as neighbours, they'd give them part of their ration books so that they could have a better reception. And that was very special to people then, because with rationing, it really was quite meagre, if you like, the amount of food that was left. Well, not left, but that you had to play with. And to do a wedding on ration books was rather frugal. So there we are. And I came back after the war. Yes, it seemed, I mean, weddings that had been postponed, if you like, because of the men being in the services. And then when they were gradually leaving and things were becoming normal, there were very nice times and days, and being able to go to the coast for your holidays and do a lot of nice things when the war ended. And I can remember being especially happy with the family after having been parted for so long during the war. So it was a nice time.